January 1945, Bavaria. Snow drifts across a column of exhausted men, their olive drab uniforms torn, boots caked with ice. The air burns with frost and gunpowder. Ahead, the black insignia of the SS glints beneath a pale sun. An American sergeant stumbles. A rifle butt slams into his back. He doesn't cry out. He just keeps walking. Somewhere beyond those frozen hills, Hitler's empire is collapsing, but his voice still echoes through the chain of command, cold, absolute, venomous. No mercy for the enemy, no compassion for the weak. To the men marching through that snow, those words are not just orders, they are a death sentence. Rumors spread like the wind. Captured Yanks executed in the Ardennes, prisoners shot near the Rhine. Men vanished in transport columns that never arrived. Yet in the silence of that march, something else moves, a quiet defiance, unseen but unbroken. These soldiers, stripped of weapons and freedom, hold on to one thing the Reich cannot crush, the will to endure. And in the coming weeks, as Hitler's Germany turns darker and more desperate, the unbreakable spirit of the captured will stand against his final command for no mercy. When the Second World War erupted in September 1939, Adolf Hitler and his generals followed a rigid, almost theatrical military code rooted in Prussian discipline and the image of the professional soldier. The Wehrmacht, though ruthless in conquest, maintained an early reputation for respecting the laws of war. Captured French, Polish, or British troops were processed, registered, and sent to camps under Geneva Convention guidelines. But this thin layer of formality would not last. Beneath the uniform of the soldier, the ideology of the Nazi state was spreading like poison. The seeds of no mercy had been planted long before the first American soldier set foot in Europe. By 1941, as German armies swept into the Soviet Union, Hitler issued the infamous Commissar order demanding the immediate execution of captured Soviet political officers. It was a turning point. The boundary between combat and murder blurred. Mercy was no longer a virtue. It was treason to the Führer's vision of total war. In Hitler's mind, compassion weakened nations. He believed the Allies, especially the Western democracies, fought under the illusion of humanity. To him, that was their fatal flaw. Germany, he claimed, must fight with iron hearts and cold blood. So when America entered the war in December 1941, Hitler's perception of the new enemy fused ideology with resentment. He saw the United States as the product of mongrel races, governed by Jewish financiers and material greed, a nation of abundance but not of spirit. In Nazi propaganda, the Yank was portrayed as both arrogant and soft, a mechanical soldier fighting for profit, not purpose. This contempt was more than rhetoric. It would soon shape orders that violated every standard of military conduct. When the first American troops landed in North Africa in late 1942, they encountered a German force still mostly professional, the Afrika Korps under Erwin Rommel. Despite fierce battles, Rommel's men often treated American prisoners with a measure of respect. Captured GIs in Tunisia were registered by the Red Cross, sent to Italy or Germany, and in many cases even shared rations with their guards. War was still, in a twisted sense, being fought by rules. But as 1943 turned to 1944, Hitler's faith in traditional warfare collapsed. The Allied bombing of German cities Hamburg, Cologne, Dresden convinced him that the West had abandoned civilization. He raged that if the enemy fought without honor, then Germany must respond without restraint. By the summer of 1944, as the Allies stormed Normandy and advanced toward Paris, Hitler's directives grew darker. He ordered his commanders to treat captured paratroopers and commandos not as soldiers, but as terrorists. In the Kommando Befehl, or Commando Order, he personally authorized the immediate execution of any captured special forces, regardless of uniform or surrender. That order extended beyond elite troops. It spread through whispers, field briefings, and fear reaching the Waffen-SS units stationed along the Western Front. When American soldiers began appearing in their sights, some German officers no longer saw enemies bound by the Geneva Convention. They saw invaders of the Reich itself. The stage was set for atrocity. Inside Hitler's headquarters at the Wolf's Lair, reports from the front enraged him. He believed that captured Americans often escaped, that they refused to cooperate, and that their spirit infected German morale. He demanded hardness, a word that in his vocabulary meant blood. "Show them no mercy," he barked to his adjutants, echoing the same tone he once used for Soviet prisoners. "The American soldier is not honorable. He is a machine." By late 1944, as the Reich's collapse loomed, these words carried the force of desperation. The Luftwaffe was grounded, cities were in ruins, and the Western Front was bleeding out. But Hitler still clung to a single belief that brutality could restore fear, and fear could restore control. It was this doctrine that the Waffen-SS carried into the forests of Belgium during the Battle of the Bulge. There, "no mercy" would no longer be a slogan. It would become a massacre. Yet before the Ardennes turned white with blood, there was still one fragile illusion left: that war, even in its cruelty, obeyed rules. That illusion would soon be shattered. In early 1943, the war had taken a decisive turn. The Axis powers were retreating on every front, North Africa collapsing, Stalingrad lost, and the Allies gaining momentum. For the first time, American forces faced the Wehrmacht in large numbers. To the Germans, these new soldiers were a mystery, confident, well-fed, and heavily equipped. Many German officers underestimated them. They called them Armeekrieger, amateur warriors. The Americans' youth and inexperience seemed laughable compared to the hardened veterans of the Eastern Front. Yet beneath that fresh-faced appearance lay a spirit of innovation and resilience. The Nazis did not understand. Captured Americans in Tunisia were among the first to experience the dual nature of German captivity. In camps controlled by the Wehrmacht, discipline prevailed. Red Cross parcels arrived, letters went home. But when SS units handled prisoners or when Gestapo officials took custody, mercy vanished. Men were interrogated, beaten, and occasionally executed as spies. By the time the Allies landed in Italy later that year, Hitler's perception of American soldiers had hardened. The growing Allied bombing campaign enraged him personally. Each destroyed German city deepened his conviction that the Western powers were waging a war of extermination. His propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, fed this fire. Radio broadcasts thundered that the Americans were criminal invaders, instruments of Jewish vengeance and capitalist greed. The effect was poisonous. Across Europe, SS officers began to interpret Hitler's words as justification for vengeance. In September 1944, as the Allies crossed into Germany's western borders, the Reich entered its final stage as a nation fighting not for victory, but for survival. Hitler's inner circle demanded loyalty through fear. Every officer was told, "The fate of Germany depends on your hardness." Captured soldiers became targets for that hardness. American airmen shot down over Germany were often mobbed by civilians furious over the destruction of their cities. In places like Frankfurt, Hamburg, and Würzburg, downed flyers were lynched in the streets before police could intervene. The Gestapo labeled these killings acts of national justice. The Wehrmacht turned a blind eye. Those who survived the mobs were herded into interrogation centers, Dulag Luft, Stalag Luft III, or Moosburg. The treatment varied wildly. Some guards maintained professionalism. Others, influenced by Nazi indoctrination, treated their prisoners with contempt. In letters smuggled home, American POWs described hunger, beatings, and psychological torment. They wrote of being forced to watch propaganda films, of sleeping in freezing huts with no heat, and of guards who repeated the same phrase, "Ihr seid Tiere." You are animals. The contrast was striking. In the East, Soviet POWs died by the millions. In the West, the treatment of Americans was inconsistent, but the line between survival and execution was thin, often depending on who held command. That uncertainty reached its breaking point in December 1944, when Hitler launched his final gamble, the Ardennes offensive, known to history as the Battle of the Bulge. He believed that one massive counterattack could split the Allied lines, capture Antwerp, and force negotiations. But it was more than strategy, it was vengeance. Hitler told his generals that this would be a battle of annihilation, where no weakness would be tolerated, no prisoners would be spared. Field Marshal Walter Model and SS General Sepp Dietrich commanded elite divisions, including the 1st SS Panzer Division Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, under Joachim Peiper. These were men raised in the culture of absolute obedience. To them, Hitler's words "no mercy" were not abstract. They were literal. When Peiper's tanks rolled into the snow-covered villages of Belgium, His men carried not only weapons, but ideology. They believed the Americans brash, inexperienced, democratic would crumble at the first taste of terror. They were wrong. In the frozen chaos that followed, hundreds of Americans were captured in small skirmishes and ambushes. The SS had no facilities to hold them and no orders to release them. The prisoners became a burden and then a message. On December 17, 1944, near a small crossroads called Bonnier, the doctrine of no mercy found its truest, most horrifying form. The Americans would later call it the Malmedy Massacre. 84 unarmed prisoners, hands raised, helmets off, were lined up in a field and gunned down by Piper's men. Survivors who tried to flee were hunted through the snow. The word spread quickly through Allied lines. The Germans had executed surrendering soldiers. No one was safe. From that moment, the phrase "no mercy" was no longer just Hitler's rhetoric. It was a reality burned into the memory of every American fighting in Europe. And yet, even as the SS believed fear would break the enemy's will, it did the opposite. Among the captured and the surviving, something hardened. The Americans would not beg. They would not surrender their humanity. The unbreakable spirit Hitler sought to crush had just begun to rise. By the time the United States entered the war, the German propaganda machine had already defined every enemy through the language of contempt. Russians were subhuman Bolsheviks, the British decaying imperialists. But the Americans, the so-called Yankees, were something different. To the Nazi mind, they represented the ultimate insult to the German worldview, a free, multi-ethnic democracy that dared to challenge the racial hierarchy of the Reich. Hitler despised the image of the American soldier. In his speeches, he mocked them as machine-made men, products of industry, not tradition. Goebbels' propaganda films portrayed GIs as reckless, womanizing cowboys, driven by material comfort rather than sacrifice. Newspapers like Der Angriff and Völkischer Beobachter published caricatures showing American soldiers as gangsters and mongrel men without honor, fighting for money and Jewish interests. This was not mere theater. Propaganda shaped policy. It allowed officers and soldiers to see mercy as weakness, to convince themselves that their cruelty was righteous defense. When Hitler issued his no mercy directives in late 1944, the ideological groundwork had already been laid. To many SS units, showing compassion to an American was not just disobedience, it was betrayal. The tragedy of that belief was its success. It blinded men to the truth that the Americans they faced were not decadent invaders, but young men fighting for ideals utterly opposed to the Nazi worldview of equality, dignity, and the rule of law. And when those same Americans fell into German hands, the Reich would learn that the so-called mechanical soldiers were far more human and far stronger than propaganda ever imagined. Hitler ruled his army not through detailed bureaucracy, but through terror and ideology. His subordinates understood that his fury was more powerful than any written directive. Yet in matters of captured enemies, his instructions were both explicit and chilling. The Commando Befehl, the Commando Order of October 1942, was among the most infamous of these decrees. It demanded that all Allied commandos, even if in uniform and attempting to surrender, were to be slaughtered to the last man. It was, in effect, an official license to commit war crimes. Though originally aimed at British Special Operations Forces, its spirit soon extended to all saboteurs, a term the SS applied freely to American paratroopers, reconnaissance units, and even stranded airmen. In meetings at the Wolf's Lair and later at the Reich Chancellery, Hitler railed that the Western Allies, especially the Americans, would use any trick to undermine German morale. He believed fear was the only cure. His words were vague enough to be interpreted broadly, but venomous enough to remove moral restraint. Officers like Heinrich Himmler and Wilhelm Keitel formalized those sentiments into orders that were passed down the chain of command, often orally to avoid documentation. Field commanders like Joachim Peiper and Otto Skorzeny understood the tone even when the text was unclear. Eliminate the enemy without hesitation. Within the Waffen-SS, obedience was sanctified. To question an order, even a criminal one, was unthinkable. Soldiers were taught that the Führer's will was above law, above humanity, above God. In such a culture, atrocities were not spontaneous acts of cruelty. They were the logical product of absolute loyalty. This is how no mercy became policy without ever needing to be written down again. It lived in the space between fanaticism and fear. Yet within this same system, cracks began to appear. Some Wehrmacht officers, raised under older military traditions, refused to carry out executions or reported SS excesses to higher command, though their protests were rarely heeded. They could see that the moral core of the German army was collapsing, consumed by the ideology it had once served. And as the war neared its end, even among the ranks of the SS, whispers of doubt began to grow among men asking themselves what kind of victory required the slaughter of unarmed prisoners. By late 1944, the German military was fractured not only by defeat, but by ideology. The Wehrmacht, though complicit in many atrocities, still contained officers who viewed themselves as traditional soldiers bound by the laws of war. The Waffen-SS, however, saw itself as the pure embodiment of Nazi belief, political warriors fighting for a racial cause. This division played out across the battlefields of Western Europe. In many sectors, captured American troops were processed properly, searched, interrogated, and transferred to POW camps under guard. But when SS divisions, particularly Piper's Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, engaged the enemy, there was no such restraint. The contrast was stark. In the Ardennes, one American lieutenant captured by the Wehrmacht was allowed to keep his personal Bible. In another sector, men seized by SS troops were stripped of winter gear and shot in the snow. The difference depended entirely on who wore the uniform across from them. Many Wehrmacht soldiers secretly despised the SS for their brutality, fearing retribution when the war ended. In private letters recovered after the conflict, some wrote with disbelief, "They bring shame upon the German name." But the SS cared nothing for legacy. They saw the war's end as irrelevant. Their duty was not survival, but purity of ideology. To them, showing mercy to a captured American meant weakness before an inferior race, a betrayal of everything Hitler preached, and yet, as the war drew closer to its end, even this line began to blur. Wehrmacht units occasionally handed prisoners to SS command, rather than risk being accused of softness. Fear of punishment, of execution for cowardice, silenced what conscience remained. In that silence, no mercy became the rule and compassion the exception. But inside that darkness, resistance was forming not among the conquerors but among the conquered. The American POWs who endured this brutality would soon become living proof that spirit could defy even the Reich's iron will. In the final years of the war, tens of thousands of American soldiers found themselves behind barbed wire, scattered across Germany and occupied Europe. Many were captured during the failed airborne drops in Holland, the encirclement battles in the Ardennes, or the brutal retreat from the Saar. They were stripped of weapons, freedom, and sometimes even names. But what remained and what their captors could never crush was spirit. Life in captivity was a slow erosion of body and mind. Camps like Stalag Luft III, Stalag 7A, and Dulag Luft became microcosms of human endurance. The guards held the guns, but the prisoners held the will. At first, many Americans were stunned by the conditions, the starvation rations, the cold, the disease. But within days, routines formed. Senior officers enforced discipline, men organized lectures, and even makeshift churches emerged. The POWs built their own societies behind the wire, a quiet defiance against despair. Letters smuggled out through the Red Cross spoke of humor as survival. One airman joked that the Germans could never defeat a man who could laugh at his own misery. Another wrote, "We have no weapons, but we have each other, and that's enough." When Hitler demanded no mercy, he misunderstood the American mind. To him, mercy was a gift from the strong to the weak. To the men in captivity, it was a belief that suffering could be endured, that dignity was not granted by rank or rifle, but by choice. Even in interrogation, that defiance persisted. German intelligence officers often complained that Americans refused to talk. They gave only name, rank, and serial number, and sometimes a grin. Inside the huts, that grin became legend. It was the quiet rebellion of men who would not break. While the brutality of Nazi policy defined much of the POW experience, not every German followed the path of cruelty. Beneath the shadow of no mercy, A quieter courage existed, men and women who risked their lives to preserve humanity. Some of them wore uniforms. In one report from Stalag Luftwaffe, a Luftwaffe officer named Hans Scharf became famous among captured American airmen. A master interrogator, he rejected violence. Instead, he spoke kindly, offered cigarettes, and listened. Ironically, his humane approach made prisoners speak more freely than any torture could. Scharf later testified that he saw the war as madness, and that his duty was to survive it without becoming a criminal. In Moosburg, guards occasionally slipped extra bread to prisoners during air raids. In smaller rural camps, local villagers defied Nazi orders by hiding downed airmen or giving them food. One Bavarian farmer's wife, when threatened by the SS, replied simply, "God does not shoot the hungry." Such moments did not erase the cruelty of the system, but they revealed something deeper. Even within the Reich's machinery of fear, conscience had not entirely died. These rare acts of mercy carried immense risk. SS patrols executed anyone suspected of aiding prisoners. In one documented case near Kassel, a German soldier who allowed an American to drink from a well was court-martialed and shot. And yet, even in the face of that terror, compassion survived. Historians later noted that among captured Americans, stories of the good Germans circulated like folklore reminders that not every enemy was evil, that even within a system of hate humanity could flicker. That flicker mattered. It kept men believing that there would one day be justice, that the world could return to light. At the core of Hitler's command for no mercy lay a fatal misunderstanding of human nature. He believed that fear and brutality could crush will, that terror could compel obedience. But war, especially in its darkest form, has always revealed the opposite, that the capacity for mercy and endurance defined strength more than cruelty ever could. The Americans who fell into German hands were not broken by brutality. They were tempered by it. Every beating, every hunger pang, every night in the freezing dark became proof of survival. German interrogators noted in frustration that the Americans display unusual morale. They shared food, songs, and jokes even when near starvation. They treated captured guards with decency when roles reversed in 1945. This was the paradox Hitler never grasped, that the will to dominate cannot defeat the will to endure. In psychological reports compiled after the war, U.S. Army historians observed that the American prisoner, even when reduced to the state of near starvation, retained a sense of purpose and identity unmatched in the enemy. Their cohesion came not from ideology, but from belief in freedom, in comradeship, in the simple right to live as men, not pawns of an empire. That belief was their unbreakable spirit, and as the Reich collapsed around them, as the SS carried out Hitler's final orders with mechanical fury, that spirit would face its greatest hour, because in the frozen fields of the Ardennes, no mercy was about to meet its consequence. The turning point was the coming one that would expose the moral rot at the heart of Hitler's empire and the defiant endurance of the men he sought to destroy. December 17, 1944. The Ardennes. Snow fell thick across the Belgian countryside, muffling the thunder of distant artillery. The forested hills near Bonnier, just south of the town of Malmedy, were blanketed in white silence until it shattered with gunfire. That morning, a column of American soldiers, roughly 120 men from Battery B of the 285th Field Artillery Observation Battalion, had been captured by an advancing spearhead of the 1st SS Panzer Division, commanded by Joachim Peiper, one of Hitler's most fanatical young officers. Peiper's men were not ordinary soldiers. They were veterans of the Eastern Front, indoctrinated in the culture of annihilation. To them, no mercy was not an order to debate. It was the law of existence. When the Americans surrendered, they were disarmed and herded into a snow-covered field near a crossroads. They stood in groups, shivering, hands raised, helmets removed. Some joked nervously. Others stared at the black uniforms surrounding them, the skull insignia glinting in the pale sun. Witnesses later said there was no warning. A command barked in German. Then machine guns opened fire. The first burst tore through the front row of prisoners. Men dropped instantly, their bodies crumpling into the snow. Those who fell early were the lucky ones. Others ran sprinting across the open field as SS gunners tracked them down with deliberate precision. Some dove into ditches, pretending to be dead. The SS walked among the bodies, firing single shots into anyone who moved. It lasted only minutes. When the smoke cleared, the field was a grotesque mosaic of blood and snow. 84 Americans lay dead. The few who survived did so by hiding beneath the corpses of their comrades until nightfall, crawling through the frozen forest toward the nearest Allied line. They would become the living witnesses to the Malmedy Massacre, one of the most infamous war crimes of the Western Front. The shock of what happened at Malmedy spread like fire through the Allied armies. By the next morning, word reached division headquarters. SS troops are murdering prisoners. Commanders passed the warning down the chain: no surrender. Fight to the end. For American soldiers, the meaning of Hitler's no mercy order was no longer abstract. It was lying in the snow. But even in this horror, something unexpected emerged, a deep, silent resolve. The survivors of Malmedy, and the men who heard their stories, fought not only for victory now, but for justice. They swore that every fallen comrade would be avenged not by vengeance in kind, but by endurance, by refusing to become what they faced. In Piper's column, the massacre did not stop the march. His armored units continued westward, striking at American positions with the ferocity of desperation. But the brutality achieved the opposite of Hitler's intent. Instead of breaking the enemy's morale, it hardened it. American resistance across the Ardennes grew fierce, disciplined, and unforgiving. At Bastogne, the surrounded 101st Airborne Division refused to surrender, despite being cut off and outnumbered. Their defiance became a symbol of the Allied spirit, the same unyielding will that Hitler's policy of terror could not crush. In later interrogations, captured SS men tried to justify Malmedy. They claimed confusion, miscommunication, and even returned fire. But survivors' testimonies told another story, one of deliberate execution, carried out under the banner of no mercy. When Piper's division eventually retreated under relentless Allied counterattacks, they left behind not a victory but a legacy of shame. Even some within the Wehrmacht were horrified. Reports filtered through that the massacre had damaged the honor of the German soldier. But by then, honor meant nothing. Hitler's war had consumed it. For the men who crawled out of that frozen field alive, survival itself became an act of defiance. Their stories, whispered in hospitals and recorded in war diaries, would later stand as evidence, not only of atrocity, but of endurance. As 1945 began, Hitler's rage deepened. News of Malmedy reached him indirectly, and rather than condemn it, he praised the hardness of his troops. That, he told his staff, is how a German soldier must fight without weakness. To him, the massacre proved loyalty. To the world, it exposed madness. And while the SS carried out these last acts of cruelty, thousands of American POWs captured in the same battle were being marched eastward toward camps deep inside Germany. Their captors followed the same doctrine. No mercy, no rest, no pity. Men trudged for days through sub-zero blizzards, frost-bitten and starving. Guards who lagged behind shot those who fell. Yet through it all, the same quiet defiance remained. One survivor recalled years later, "They could break our bodies, but they never touched what we carried inside." That was the heart of the turning point, not only in the war, but in the moral balance between tyranny and humanity. Hitler's empire was collapsing, but his cruelty only revealed the strength of those he sought to destroy. And as Allied armies pressed deeper into Germany, the full weight of no mercy from Malmedy to the forced marches to the death camps would come, crashing down in the open for the world to see. January 1945, somewhere in central Germany. The war had entered its coldest phase, not just in weather but in spirit. Hitler's empire, though burning at the edges, still clung to a twisted illusion of control. Entire divisions were collapsing, yet the orders from Berlin grew only more fanatical. One of those orders, repeated in every dispatch to the front, read simply, "Prisoners are a burden. The enemy must not live to fight again." For the tens of thousands of Allied soldiers now in German captivity, that phrase became their new reality. The prisoners marched. Day after day, in columns stretching for miles, they moved across a Germany being eaten alive by its own defeat. Villages smoldered, bridges lay shattered, and the roar of distant artillery was constant. They called it the Death March of 45. For many, it began when Allied bombers destroyed supply lines feeding the POW camps. With no food, no transport, and no safe place to hold prisoners, the SS decided to move them on foot deeper into the collapsing Reich. Thousands of Americans, Britons, Canadians, and Soviets were forced from their barracks at gunpoint and ordered to march east or south through the snow. Some wore thin cotton uniforms. Others had no boots. One American lieutenant later recalled, "The snow was up to our knees. Every mile another man went down. The guards didn't stop, they just fired a shot and kept walking. Food was almost non-existent. A few potatoes, a piece of stale bread, sometimes nothing for days. The men learned to scrape frost from their sleeves for water. Some traded watches or rings for a handful of soup from sympathetic villagers. Others were beaten for even looking toward a farmhouse. Still, even here, humanity flickered in unexpected places. An old German woman once slipped a crust of bread into a prisoner's pocket when the guards weren't looking. A Luftwaffe soldier quietly tossed a cigarette to a man shivering in the snow. Small gestures, but enough to remind the prisoners that mercy still existed, somewhere beneath the ruins of the Reich. Inside the camps that remained, conditions were collapsing. At Stalag Luft III, once a model POW camp for Allied airmen, food rations fell to half, then a quarter. Men boiled snow to make thin soups, tore blankets into makeshift boots. Guards were nervous, jittery. Many knew the war was lost, but feared retreating or surrendering without orders. In the barracks, rumors spread faster than disease. Hitler was dead. Berlin was surrounded. The Russians were near. Then, the next day, the rumor would reverse: Hitler alive, the Western Front collapsing, the Allies in retreat. Truth had dissolved into the fog of propaganda, yet what remained steady was the prisoners' will to survive. Officers organized secret marching orders, assigning men to look after the weakest, share rations, and rotate positions in line to block the wind. The stronger shielded the frail. They sang to stay awake. One British officer, remembering the ordeal decades later, said, "We discovered that courage isn't just about fighting. It's about not letting someone die when you can still stand." Elsewhere, in Hitler's bunker beneath Berlin, the world was narrowing to madness. The Führer's map showed armies that no longer existed. His voice trembled with rage, not reason. Every day he issued new commands to hold imaginary lines, to destroy cities rather than surrender them, to shoot deserters and prisoners alike. It was in those final months that his concept of no mercy reached its purest and most horrifying form, as Soviet forces closed in on the east and Americans advanced from the west. German SS units executed prisoners by the hundreds to prevent their liberation. At Gardelegen, over 1,000 prisoners, mostly Allied and Eastern forced laborers, were herded into a barn, doused with gasoline and set on fire. Those who tried to escape were shot. When American troops arrived days later, the scene was unspeakable. Bodies charred, stacked in rows, the smell of burned straw and flesh still in the air. One soldier wrote in his diary, "There are no words for what we saw, only silence." But even in this inferno, the Reich's cruelty achieved the opposite of its design. The massacres did not frighten the Allies. They stole them. Every liberated town, every opened camp revealed another layer of horror and another reason never to stop. American and British soldiers, hardened by years of war, were now driven by something deeper than orders: the need to end this darkness forever. When the 11th Armored Division liberated Mauthausen, they found prisoners reduced to skeletons, still standing at attention as the gates burst open. One soldier dropped his rifle and wept. Another whispered, "My God, what have they done?" It was the same across Germany, from Buchenwald to Dachau, from Nordhausen to Flossenburg. The world was finally seeing what Hitler's no mercy truly meant. And with every liberated camp, the moral victory of the Allied soldiers, those who endured, who refused to mirror their captors, became clear. They had not only won the war of weapons, but the war of humanity. By April 1945, the death marches ended. Those who survived were barely human in form, frostbitten, starved, hollow-eyed, but alive. When American tanks rolled past them, some could barely raise their hands. Others saluted weakly, whispering, "Home." They had outlasted Hitler's empire not through strength of arms, but through strength of spirit. The Reich that promised no mercy had devoured itself. But the men it sought to break, the prisoners, the soldiers, the civilians who held on to compassion in the face of tyranny, became the living proof that mercy itself is the ultimate defiance. April 1945. The war was ending, but not quietly. Across Germany, chaos reigned. The once proud cities of the Reich were nothing but twisted steel and ash. Civilians wandered through streets that no longer had names. Bridges, rail lines, and factories lay in ruins, and scattered among the debris were the survivors of tens of thousands of Allied prisoners who had endured Hitler's no-mercy orders and somehow lived long enough to see liberation. When the first American tanks rolled into camps like Stalag 7A, Dachau, and Mauthausen, soldiers were not prepared for what they saw. General Dwight D. Eisenhower himself would later write, "The things I saw beggar description." The visual evidence and the verbal testimony of starvation, cruelty, and bestiality were overpowering. The men who emerged from behind the wire barely resembled soldiers anymore. Their uniforms hung loose over skeletal frames. Their faces were gray, their eyes sunken, yet behind those eyes burned something extraordinary defiance. One Army medic described it best. "They saluted us when we entered the camp." Imagine that. Starving, dying men, and they still had the discipline to stand and salute. That gesture, repeated in dozens of camps across Germany, became a silent symbol of victory. Not the victory of nations or generals, but of endurance. The numbers tell their own brutal truth. Between late 1944 and May 1945, an estimated 80,000 Allied prisoners were forced on death marches across collapsing Germany. Thousands perished from exposure, disease, or execution along the way. At least 3,500 Americans are believed to have died in captivity during the final months alone. But those who survived carried with them the unspoken story of the war, not one of battles or tanks, but of survival against deliberate cruelty. When news of atrocities like Malmedy, Gardlingen, and the death marches reached Allied headquarters, it changed everything about how the war would be remembered. The phrase "no mercy," once Hitler's rallying cry, became the foundation of his regime's downfall. Because mercy denied by him, preserved by his enemies, became the moral high ground from which the Allies would judge his crimes. In the months that followed, investigators poured into the liberated territories, collecting evidence, photographs, and witness statements. They found burned barns filled with ashes and bone fragments. They uncovered mass graves along country roads where exhausted prisoners had been executed during marches. They interviewed survivors who still bore frostbite scars and bullet wounds from escape attempts. What emerged was a mosaic of horror, not random, not chaotic, but systematic. The cruelty had been organized, written into orders, stamped with official seals. And at the top of that pyramid stood one man who never gave the command to stop Adolf Hitler. When Hitler took his own life in his Berlin bunker on April 30th, 1945, it was not a warrior's death. It was the final act of a man unwilling to face the consequences of his own inhumanity. In that moment, the no-mercy doctrine died with him. But justice, slow, deliberate, methodical, was only beginning. At Nuremberg, the surviving architects of his regime stood in the dock to answer for the crimes committed under his authority. Among the charges brought by the Allied prosecutors were the execution and mistreatment of prisoners of war, a direct violation of the 1929 Geneva Convention. American, British, and Soviet lawyers presented case after case, the Malmedy massacre, where 84 unarmed Americans were shot in the snow, the Gardlingen atrocity, where over 1,000 prisoners were burned alive, the forced marches, where guards had orders to kill anyone who fell behind. The evidence was irrefutable. Photographs, captured documents, and eyewitness testimony spoke louder than any defense. One prosecutor, Justice Robert H. Jackson, told the court, "These prisoners were not killed in the heat of battle. They were executed in cold blood. Their only crime was that they had surrendered." The world listened, and for the first time, an entire system of war crimes was laid bare before humanity. But justice alone could not erase what had been endured. For the men who survived, the return home was not triumphal. It was haunted. They were welcomed as heroes, yet many could not sleep without hearing the crunch of snow beneath marching boots or the echo of a rifle shot in the night. Some carried frostbite wounds for life. Others carried the guilt of having survived when friends had not. Still, when asked years later how they had endured, their answers were always the same. We just refused to give them the satisfaction of breaking us. It was that quiet defiance, that belief in something larger than fear, that Hitler could never understand. He believed cruelty would crush the human spirit. But the war proved the opposite. Mercy, compassion, and courage survived even under the heel of tyranny. And when the smoke cleared over Europe, those values became the foundation for a new world. One built not on conquest, but on the promise that such inhumanity would never be allowed again. May 1945. Silence descended across Europe, a silence so vast that it seemed unnatural after 6 years of thunder. The guns were quiet. The skies, once streaked with contrails and fire, now held only smoke drifting from the ruins of cities. In that silence, across camps and hospitals and shattered villages, the survivors began to speak. They spoke of hunger, frost, and death, of comrades who never woke, of guards who obeyed orders without question, and of rare souls who defied them. They spoke not in anger, but with a strange, steady calm, as if their very survival demanded that the truth be told. Among them were the Americans who had marched across half of Germany on bleeding feet. Men from the 106th Infantry Division, captured in the Ardennes. Airmen from the 8th and 9th Air Forces, shot down over occupied Europe. Medics, engineers, tank crews, all bound together by one shared ordeal. They had endured Hitler's no mercy. When they returned home, parades awaited them. Flags waved, brass bands played, families wept. Yet behind the cheers was something unspoken, the invisible burden of memory. For many, civilian life felt surreal. The sound of a car backfiring made them flinch. The cold of winter stirred flashbacks of the marches. The smell of burning wood could transport them back to the barns of Gardelegen or the huts of Stalag Luft 3rd. In America, military psychiatrists called it battle fatigue. Today it would be known as post-traumatic stress, but these men rarely spoke of it. Their silence wasn't weakness, it was reverence, a way to honor those who hadn't made it home, and yet, their silence changed the world. Because when they finally did speak, often years later, in interviews, memoirs, or war crimes testimonies, their words helped define a new code of humanity. The Geneva Conventions were rewritten in 1949, expanding the protections for prisoners of war, civilians, and medical personnel. The testimonies of American and Allied POWs were cited directly in those revisions. From their suffering came the principle that even in total war, mercy must remain sacred, that discipline, honor, and humanity are not luxuries but the last defense against barbarism. There were other, quieter legacies too. In Germany itself, many former soldiers, even some who had once enforced the harshest orders, began to confront their own guilt. The trials, the photographs, the testimonies shattered the myth that obedience could justify cruelty. One former Wehrmacht officer, years later, confessed in an interview, "We thought strength meant no mercy, but in the end, mercy was the only strength that lasted." Across the Atlantic, American veterans founded associations for former POWs. They organized reunions, wrote letters, and built monuments. Their motto, often carved in stone, was simple and defiant: "Freedom isn't free, but the spirit is unbreakable." At one such gathering in the 1970s, a gray-haired veteran of the 106th Division addressed the crowd. His voice was frail, but his words carried the weight of every man who had once marched beside him. "We were starved, beaten, and forgotten, but we never stopped being soldiers. And that's why we won." In time, the story of Hitler's no-mercy order became more than a tale of cruelty. It became a moral boundary for generations to come. It reminded the world that cruelty is never strength, and that quiet, stubborn endurance is the truest form of resistance. Every act of compassion that survived the Reich, every guard who hesitated to pull a trigger, every villager who shared a crust of bread, every prisoner who shielded another from the wind became part of that legacy. Because in those moments, humanity itself had refused to die. By the 21st century, the men who survived were few. Their memories, however, live on in archives, in museums, in the pages of history. They remind us that Hitler's vision of no mercy was not just a military policy, it was a philosophy of dehumanization. And it failed. Completely. What endured instead was the quiet, indestructible spirit of those he tried to break, the men who, starving in the snow, still saluted the flag of freedom. The snow has long melted. The camps are silent. The flags they once saluted now hang in museums, faded by time. But when the wind moves through those places, through Dachau, through Mauthausen, through the open fields where prisoners once marched, it carries with it a whisper. Mercy endures. Always. History often remembers wars through their battles. The tanks that rolled, the cities that burned, the flags that fell. But the truest measure of a war's cost is not found in victory parades or casualty lists. It's found in the faces of those who endured what no human should. Hitler's command for no mercy was meant to destroy the spirit of his enemies. It failed, because mercy, though mocked by tyrants as weakness, became the quiet engine of resistance. Every prisoner who chose compassion over vengeance, every soldier who refused to surrender his humanity even when stripped of freedom, proved that true strength is not the absence of pity, but the courage to hold on to it when the world collapses. The men who survived the camps and marches of 1945 carried that truth home with them. They didn't speak of hatred. They spoke of endurance. They didn't glorify revenge. They glorified survival, discipline, and faith in decency itself. And through their silence, the world learned something profound, that the line between civilization and barbarism is drawn not by armies, but by conscience. The ruins of the Third Reich still stand in fragments, concrete reminders of a moment when humanity nearly forgot itself. But among those ruins, the legacy of the unbroken remains stronger. They proved that no order, no ideology, no tyrant could extinguish the human spirit. Even in snow, starvation, and captivity, they found the one weapon Hitler could never command: mercy. That is why their story endures. Not as a tale of death, but of defiance. Not as a warning of weakness, but as proof of what it means to remain human even when humanity itself is under siege. The war ended long ago, but in every act of compassion shown to an enemy, in every soldier who spares instead of destroys, the echo of those who survived still lives on. Because in the end, the Reich fell, but mercy did not. Soft orchestral strings, archival footage, liberated POWs saluting their rescuers, snow melting on barbed wire. Title fades on screen. The spirit of mercy is the final victory.